Hi everybody, how are you all doing today? This is going to be the introduction video for the David Abram reading, which is a selection from the book The Spell of the Sensuous. So right away we can sort of start thinking about the playful language of the book title. So talking about like a spell, like a magical thing that encaptures you, kind of along with the theme of language. So spelling and language. The subtitle for this text is Perception and Language in a More Than Human World. So we're looking at that link that we've been exploring throughout the course, that link between perception, or how you see the world, and language. And then this text is going to begin to show us the eco-critical perspective, that critical thinking lens that we introduced briefly in Unit 1. So our selection from this text is taken from the section, the chapter of the book that's called The Flesh of Language. So that chapter title suggests this analogy or this metaphor for language as like a skin or a wrapper or something that surrounds and envelops, experience and perception. And then our section, so we're only going to read part of that chapter, and our section is called Toward an Ecology of Language. So the vocabulary of the section title really hints at the eco-critical lens, but it is sort of suggesting that this is a theory that's moving us toward conceiving of the world as an environment that is made of language. So an ecology of language suggests that it's an ecosystem made up of language. So during this chapter, we will be presented with an alternate view on the shaping of meaning through language. So far during this class, we have seen really primary examples of the conventionalist view of language, or the idea that language meaning is shaped through social agreement. And we'll remember from our very first major reading from Ferdinand de Saussure, he gives us the idea that language is arbitrary, so the meaning is not connected to the word. It's conventional, so it's invented by the speech community. And then he gives us that relational meaning, the relational feature of meaning, so that words mean what they mean in the context of other words. So this article that we read today will directly reference some of those ideas from Ferdinand de Saussure. And it's going to give it an opposing viewpoint of language. So this is going to present the naturalist view of language. The idea that words have meaning based on our perception of the world, based on so our sights, sounds, feelings. What are they? Tastes. Sight, sound, touch, taste. Why can't I think? Smells. So like those senses, the sensual world is what gives us words that we use to describe those senses. So this connects in a little bit. You might be triggering that keyword sense from Victoria Welby's reading. But she was meaning more like the context of meaning. So we could begin to make some connections between those arguments and the arguments we see here from the eco-critical perspective. But all in all, it's showing us the naturalist view of language, which is opposed to the conventionalist view of language. And you might remember that that contrast from our lesson in the shaping of meaning through language. I think we called it Making Meaning with Language from Unit 1. It was our third lesson. So some of those keywords might be familiar to you already. Before we get into this overview of the text itself, the words that we'll read, I just want to mention that while you're reading on your own, you'll be able to find a lot of really great examples of the conditional reasoning structure in this text. So as a reminder, the conditional reasoning structure is like saying an if-then statement. So if we accept these ideas, or if these are the circumstances, then these will be the outcomes, or then this is what we will think. It's very similar to the cause and effect reasoning structure. So as you're reading, really pick up on those. Sometimes the then is just implied, but really try and pick up on those, like if this, then that, types of reasoning moves or logical moves. And then secondly, just kind of a heads up for connecting this text to others that we'll read in this unit. That look for any references you see to like web structures, like spider web structures, because those will just come in handy later in the unit, and we're getting close to the end, so we can use as much kind of help as we can get. Okay, so looking at this text, let's just preview it a little bit. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.5 to 10 pages long. So it's relatively shorter, I would say. It is written from 1996, so the language style will probably be a little more familiar than that Victoria Welby article where the language style was very tough. Let's see, I'm looking at page 77 where our reading selection begins. It has the title chapter at the very top, The Flesh of Language, and then the section title, Toward an Ecology of Language. I'm looking at the introduction paragraph here, and this is where we get into the they say, and then the author will begin his I say portion of the argument. He says, the more prevalent view of language, at least since the scientific revolution, and still assumed in some manner by most linguists today, considers any language to be a set of arbitrary but conventionally agreed upon words or signs, linked by a purely formal system of syntactic and grammatical rules. And then I see some italics. I see the word code. I see the word representing. Looking down, I see in the very next paragraph, there's this hyphenated word that's calling my attention. It's Merleau-Ponty. So this is, I think, from like the 1800s or maybe the very early 1900s. I mean, I don't think it's from the 1700s. I don't know. Not my area of expertise, this guy. But I know he's an old writer. But this is the specific context or the specific they say that David Abram will be engaging with during this whole chapter. So he starts off with a general, in general, they, meaning scholars of language, say language is a code of arbitrary and conventional meanings. And then he says, Merleau-Ponty says, if we agree with Merleau-Ponty's assertion that active speech is the generative core of all language, how could we understand language as an arbitrary conventional agreement? So he's refuting or contrasting the conventional view versus whatever this guy Merleau-Ponty is talking about. He identifies a problem. His problem is really similar to a problem that Victoria Welby identified, very similar to a problem that you'll see in Friedrich Nietzsche's article later this unit. He says, Merleau-Ponty suggests Such a view of language, so the conventionalist view of language, can arise only at a time when the fresh creation of meaning has become a rare occurrence, a time when people commonly speak in conventional and ready-made ways. In short, when meaning has become impoverished. So he's suggesting that this conventionalist view of meaning stems from a social condition where people are not using words to accurately reflect their sensations and perceptions of the world. So that's his general context. And then his specific context that really leads into the eco-critical lens has to do with the question of human exceptionalism or anthropocentrism, the idea that human beings are like the most evolved, top, most powerful life form on Earth, which is, I would also say, the more prevalent view of the role of humans in the ecosystem. But David Abram is wanting to question that idea. So he's questioning what he calls the idea of human specialness, human exceptionalism, anthropocentrism. So he kind of gives us a background of this idea to really link into the eco-critical context. He talks about Aristotle, Descartes, and Darwin. And then he says, in our own time, it is language conceived as an exclusively human property that is most often used to demonstrate the excellence of humankind relative to all other species. And then he gives a lot of examples of the different ways that other species use, tools, and they use communication, that maybe we can consider those as a form of language. We will look at, or depending on the order that you're viewing this, we already have looked at a class discussion where we'll get to just informally talk about what do we consider to be language. So what kinds of communications, gestures, signals, signs, images, what counts as language, to really reopen and shake up this question of whether it's just arbitrary and conventional, or if there's something more naturally connected between the sign and the signified and the signifier. All right, so he gives us that background about human exceptionalism. And then he contrasts all of these examples of animal types of discourse to human types of discourse. He on page 79, at the middle of the second paragraph, he kind of points out his major critique of the conventionalist view. He says, only by isolating the secondary layer of conventional meanings from the felt significance carried by the tone, rhythm, and resonance of spoken expressions can we conceive of language as a code, as a determinate and mappable structure composed of arbitrary signs linked by purely formal rules. And only thus, by conceiving language as a purely abstract phenomenon, can we claim it as an exclusively human attribute. So David Abram is saying more or less that all creatures possess language. We just don't understand their messages and codes. Therefore, we just ignore it. We say that it's not language. So he's talking about how it is that language becomes abstracted from experience and nature and perception and sensation. And then he talks about ignoring and overlooking various connections. And just, another heads up, this theme of ignoring and overlooking. We saw this a little bit in, I'm reminded really of Edward Sapire's language, where he says it's an illusion to think this and this about language. But we will see this again in Friedrich Nietzsche's argument about how we come to find, how we come to use the word leaf to mean all leaves. He says a word is a concept, and a concept by its very nature forces us to ignore and overlook specific differences and similarities between the things that we perceive. So he goes on to he talks about the flesh or the sense or the body of language. On page 80, he offers a social critique, and he tells us that the felt meanings of words have been forgotten because of the conventional meanings. And I think that this, I might be giving away a detail from your informal writing, but I think that this is his thesis, and I think it's repeated at a couple of different places in the essay, in the chapter. So on page 80, when the author says that although we may be oblivious to the gestural, somatic dimension of language, having repressed it in favor of strict dictionary definitions and the abstract precision of specialized terminologies, this dimension remains subtly operative in our speaking and writing. If, that is, our words have any significance whatsoever. For meaning, as we have said, remains rooted in the sensory life of the body. It cannot be completely cut off from the soil of direct perceptual experience without withering and dying. And to me, this is really linking back to what Victoria Welby says about, the sense of meaning, the significance of meaning, and then those analogies that she uses to compare language to like a rooted thing or an evolving thing. Similarly, Ferdinand de Saussure uses similar analogies too, comparing language to a growing, living, evolving entity. And then right after that, we have the so what larger significance that ties us into eco-criticism, the eco-critical lens. We have a supporting example of two friends meeting and exchanging language. And we have this analogy of the meaning of language riding on the surface of the tones and rhythms of expression. He says it's kind of like a wave. And then he mentions again that need for a creative break. So breaking out of old, confined, stale language uses to create and construct something new. He repeats that larger significance towards the end of page 81. On page 82, we have a couple of metaphors that remind us of where we get onomatopoeic words. And we will remember from Ferdinand de Saussure's chapter where he discusses onomatopoeia a little bit. And he says these words don't count as like signifiers. They aren't arbitrary and conventional. So he gives that counter argument in his text. So we can make a connection between those two. And then right after that, he begins to mention Ferdinand de Saussure. And he says, in order for linguists to view language as a scientific discipline, they needed to, break it down and separate it into pieces. He talks about the organic living system of language, and then he brings up this image of a matrix or a web work. So pay attention to those kinds of images in this text. On page 83, he talks about the relational feature of language. And I don't think that we studied this specifically from Ferdinand de Saussure's text. We only really got into conventional and arbitrary. But relational is another key feature. So take note during this section. So he talks about the web some more. At the bottom, he talks about the difference between genuine expressive speech and speech that merely repeats established formulas. So for me, I'm thinking right away of Victoria Welby, how she says she's sort of trapped in the deadlocks of stale language. He says language, it needs to be remade and altered. Language's structures are created at some historical moment, and this can only have been affected by active expressive speech. So when de Saussure told us, we always experience language meaning as inherited from the past, Abram is saying, it is inherited. It was created at some time. But at that time of creation, those words had meaning. Those words had sensation. Those words, maybe when you heard one of those words, it would maybe send a tingle through you in some way. The way I think usually with like poetic language and with offensive language, we still can perceive that physical sensation where you might hear some terminology that makes you so angry that you might literally feel like a chill or a tingle of anger, or maybe you hear some language that is so beautiful that like it sort of moves you in a positive way. So we still do have those connections to sensuous expressions of language. Moving on, he talks about language and gesture. So when I hear gesture, I'm looking ahead and trying to help us wrap up through Unit 3 and thinking of the texts that we will read from Octavia Butler and Benjamin Hale. And they talk about gesture. So, trying to make these connections as we go. And then on page 84, we see this synthesis statement where the author is connecting what Merleau-Ponty says with what Ferdinand de Saussure says. He is saying, he contrasts the two. And then in the next paragraph, he says, what Merleau-Ponty retains from Saussure is Saussure's notion of any language as an interdependent web-like system of relations. So at the first synthesis statement, he's saying, Merleau-Ponty is refuting de Saussure. And then at the next one, he's kind of saying, in this way, Merleau-Ponty is limiting or qualifying de Saussure's argument. And then at the bottom of those two synthesis statements, he repeats what I think to be his thesis. He says that ultimately it is not human language that is primary, but rather the sensuous, perceptual life world, whose wild participatory logic ramifies and elaborates itself in language. What a rich quotation. Each of those words can be unpacked and defined to be repeated in your own words to make that claim meaningful to you. So turning the page into our last page, 85. He's continuing to talk about this theme of interdependence, which is visualized in that web-like matrix. So this is really ringing a bell from the critical thinking texts that we had read in Unit 2. And then he mentions he has a quote from John Muir, and then he mentions how can we understand the term tree without understanding all the other trees, and then the insects that pollinate and fertilize the trees, and then the animals that eat from the trees, drop the seeds and spread. And like he goes into this ecologically sort of visual process analysis of like how can we understand the concept of tree as an interdependent context. And for me, this is David Abram taking that analogy that Ferdinand de Saussure gives us. He tells us, tree, and he shows us the shape, and he says this is the sound image and this is the concept, as though it's split. Two simple ingredients make up our entire understanding of tree. But to me, this is David Abram really pushing and extending and changing that idea of how do we understand a tree into his own context of the ecological interdependence of what we understand. And this idea too, the difference between concept and reference, was introduced in our Making Meaning in Language lesson from Unit 1. So we talked about, how do we understand a diamond without also understanding everything from what a diamond looks like to its chemical composition of the stone itself, to the political history of diamond mining, and then also the context of lab created diamonds, or the alternative for like cubic zirconium. So we understand each concept as a humongous web of interdependent ideas and concepts, not just sound, image, concept, and that's the whole sign. There's so much more to it than that. So to me, that's a strong connection between what Ferdinand de Saussure was talking about, 100 years ago, and then what David Abram was talking about, 20 years ago. 25 years ago. So the tree. And then we will see this idea mentioned again, the tree, in Friedrich Nietzsche's essay. And that one's even older. That one's, I think, from 1887. So that concept of the tree. And then he connects to eco-criticism. He repeats his thesis. He says, it is this dynamic, interconnected reality that provokes and sustains all our speaking, lending something of its structure to all of our various languages. So there's something in nature that's giving us our reasoning, our logic, our language. And then I really like, he does some quotations. If you would like, please send me a message and I will copy for you the appendix that shows what these footnotes are. I'm just taking a guess. I'm thinking they look biblical, so maybe they're from the Bible. And then he ends us kind of with this, he almost ends us with this quotation again from Merleau-Ponty saying, it's the very voice of the trees, the waves, and the forest, which is what our language comes from. And I love the way this sort of connects to that Pocahontas song, Paint with All the Colors of the Wind, just for fun. I like that. And then he gives us his closing remarks about how this all can link up to his overall eco-critical significance with biodiversity and extinction, et cetera, really relevant for our current times. So that was our overview for this text. For your homework, I would like you to read and annotate the text fully, and compose an argument outline where you will determine at least one quotation that you think represents the thesis. So you'll have a quotation and then a paraphrase in your own words. And then at least 2 quotations for a claim that this author makes that sort of supports that thesis. So you'll have a quotation again and then a paraphrase in your own words. If you have any questions, reply to the announcements so I can get back to you. Thanks.